Welcome to this video of Introduction to Music Fundamentals B, where we're going to start writing chords. And this is the exciting part of your training where we really start doing some fun things. So let's have a look at an example which you might receive. Imagine that you've been given this question and it says, write the following triads in 4 parts. So we see the question there are the empty grand staves for us to use. And underneath, there is a capital D, and then chord 1, chord 5, chord 2, and chord 4, 6. So what do these things tell us? Firstly, the capital D tells us that we're working with D major. Okay. Then chord 1 tells us that in D major we're going to be working with chord 1, then chord 5, both of which are major because they're capitals. Do you see that the 1 is a capital, the 5 is a capital? But chord 2, as you see there, is a minor chord. And the capital for chord 4 there tells us that we're working with a major chord. The little 6 next to it tells us that the chord is in an inversion. It's in first inversion. When there's a little 6 on its own, we're working in first inversion. So let's work through this step by step. The first step is that we're going to write out a chord table for D major. Then we're going to write the correct key signature at the beginning of the answer. Then we're going to identify which chords we need to write. And we're also going to work out which notes need to be doubled. And then we're going to make sure that the bass notes are correct for the specified inversions. So let's do these one by one. Here's step 1. First step is to write out a chord table. So you'll see on the far left-hand side, I've written out the key signature for D major. You would need to go to your chord table and work out what the key signature is for the exercise that you have and make sure that you've written the sharps or flats in the correct order. Now you'll see that I've written all of the chords out. The way that you do this, you write out the scale that you're working with. In this case, it was D major scale. You first write out the scale, and then you create the triads just above them by adding thirds above them, just like we've practiced before. Now you'll remember that chords 1, 4, and 5 in the major key are major triads. Chords 2, 3, and 6 are minor triads, and chord 7 is its special case, the diminished triad. So I've labeled them all correctly from the beginning. Step 2, we're going to write the key signature in at the beginning of the answer. So we put the D major key signature at the beginning. Remember that the bass clef, the key signature is always one line or space lower than the one in the treble clef. So there's step 2. We've written in the key signature. Step 3, circle or indicate somewhere the chords that you're going to have to use in this particular exercise. You'll remember that we were going to use chord 1, then chord 5, then chord 2, and then chord 4, 6. Now we need to decide which notes are going to be doubled. So in a major triad, you can double the root of the triad or its fifth. And you'll see that chords 1, 4, and 5 are major, so we know which notes we'll be able to double. Minor triads, on the other hand, we can only double the third. We are working with a minor triad in this particular example. Chord 2 is minor, so in that chord we have to double the third. Step 5, we need to make sure that the bass notes are correct. So let's just go back to our chord table. For chord 1, chord 1 in this case doesn't have any numbers next to it in our example, so it's going to be in root position. That means that the root note is going to be the bass note. So the lowest note in this chord must be a D. So when we go to our answer, we have to have a D in the bass part. And you'll see I've written a D and the stem is going down to indicate that it is the bass part. We go back to the chord table. Let's look at chord 5. Chord 5 is also in root position. It doesn't have any 6 or 6/4 next to it, indicated in the question. So it's got to be in its root position. That means that the root of the chord must be the bass note. The root of chord 5 is an A. So when we go to our answer, it must be an A in the bass, and the stem must go down. All right. Then, if we have a look at chord 2, chord 2 in this case is a minor triad. It's also required that it's in root position. In this case, the root is an E. So we need to have an E in the bass part. The last one, you'll see there, it's chord 4/6. So we go to chord 4. Chord 4 is G, B, D. Those are the 3 notes. The root is G, the third is B, and the 5th is D. Okay? We aren't working with the root as the bass. The little 6 tells us that we're working with the third as the bass. The third was G, B, D. So the B needs to be the bass note. And you'll see that I've done that in the answer there. Okay. Now, let's have a look at the real answer that I've put here. Let's have a look at chord 1 here. You'll see that the bass note is the D. That's what we filled in first. A major triad, you have to double the root or the 5th. We're working with the chord D, F sharp, A. So we could use D, we could have 2 Ds, or we could have 2 As. You'll see that I've used 2 Ds. There's a D in the bass part, and there's a D in the alto part. We also need an F sharp, and you'll see that I've put the F sharp in the soprano voice, and an A in the tenor voice. Okay, we've got all 3 notes represented, and one of those notes, the root, has been doubled. In the second chord, chord 5, 5 is also a major triad, so we are allowed to double the root or the 5th. Chord 5 in this key is A, C sharp, E. So we can have 2 A's or we can have 2 E's. You'll see that I've doubled the root in this case, 2 A's. There's an A in the bass and there's an A in the soprano. Then I've put the C sharp of the chord in the tenor voice, and I've put the E in the alto voice. Now look at chord 2. You'll remember that chord 2 is a minor chord. So we've got to double the third. This minor chord is E, G, B. So the G has to be doubled. And you'll see that I've put the soprano and the alto on a G. When they both share a note like that, when 2 parts share a note, you indicate that by putting the tail up and the tail down. That means that the soprano and the alto are singing the same note. Then I've put the E in the bass and I've put the B in the tenor voice. Now let's have a look also at chord 4/6. Chord 4 is G, B, D. It's in first inversion, which means the third of the chord is in the bass. The B is in the bass. We can either double the root, which is G, or the 5th, which is a D. So I've chosen to double the root, which is a G. And you'll see that I've done it again in the soprano and alto. The soprano going up and the alto going down. So that's just basically how this works. It's not very difficult, just making sure that you've followed all of the steps. In our next video, we're going to be looking at something or sets of chords called cadences. A cadence is a set of chords which appears at the end of a musical phrase. So it feels like you're coming to an end. At this level, a cadence consists only of 2 chords next to each other. And we're going to learn 4 different types of cadences. The perfect cadence, which is called 5-1. The imperfect cadence, where it can be 1-5, or 2-5, or 4-5. Any of those combinations. 1-5, 2 to 5 or chord 4 to 5. The plagal cadence is chord 4 to 1, and the interrupted cadence is chord 5 to chord 6. I'm going to continue in the next video to discuss how we write those cadences.